Hello, everyone, and welcome to this conversation on conflict and collaborative teams. My name is Cecile Green, co-founder of Round Sky Solutions and developer of Collab, a communication toolkit for self-organizing teams. And I'm delighted to be here today with my colleagues Charlotte Root, Rebecca Fisher-McGinty, and Sarah Mihalik. In this call, we're going to explore some of the unique challenges collaborative or self-organizing teams face, such as how to integrate conflicting perspectives. Truth is, conflict can be really useful in producing meaningful outcomes, but it's actually really tricky to consistently achieve. This dialogue will introduce you to a map of how conflict works and the single biggest principle for using conflict to build capacity and effective action. Maybe you are watching this recording because you want to learn why conflict occurs and what you can do to get better at managing it. Perhaps you've tried processes like nonviolent communication or appreciative inquiry and have found that it just hasn't worked to get to the root of issues. If so, you're in the right place, and we're delighted to have you join us. In this call, we're planning to talk about where conflict comes from, discuss some practical tools for turning conflict into fuel for your team, dig into some ways to manage hot situations for yourself, and share some concrete tools for harnessing conflict before we wrap up with some questions and comments. Before we get started, though, we wanted to offer you just a little bit more of an introduction to each of us on the call and why we're here. First, I wanted to introduce Charlotte Root, a Level 2 Collab facilitator and Round Sky worker owner. Charlotte, will you tell us a little bit about yourself and what brings you to this call?
Yeah, thanks, Cecile. I am a social environmental activist, and I work with Collab as a collaborative leadership facilitator and trainer, and I'm really thrilled to be discussing conflict with you today.
Welcome, Charlotte. I'm looking forward to this conversation on conflict with you. And Rebecca Fisher-McGinty, our Round Sky communication wizard and also worker owner. Introduce yourself a little.
Hi, yeah, I'm Rebecca, and I manage all communications at Round Sky. Also here in New Orleans, where I live, I'm a part of a collective that does racial justice organizing, and I'm excited to dive into this conversation.
Welcome, Rebecca. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
And Sarah Mihalik, a Vermont consultant and Round Sky intern, has joined us as well. Sarah, please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Sarah. I live in Vermont. And I have a lot of volunteer experience working with grassroots organizations, mostly in Vermont for social and environmental justice issues. And also 6 years ago, I started a small business called The Flashbulb, where I work as a self-employment coach. I'm excited to join you all today. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, welcome, Sarah. So glad you could make it. And I'm Cecile Green, Round Sky co-founder and developer of Collab. I've been a social entrepreneur for over 25 years and founded Round Sky to provide solutions to some of the most endemic and entrenched conflicts we see happening all the time in collaborative teams. After starting and running a range of different social ventures from online education to farming, in the last 5 years, I've turned my focus to working directly with the teams and leaders building and running mission-driven enterprises to help them overcome such challenges as interpersonal conflicts, inefficient and frustrating systems for prioritizing, unpredictable accountability, unclear processes for making decisions, muddy decisions with poor follow-through, ineffective processes for having group conversations, and frustration with the time it takes to get everyone's input. We've developed Collab as a communication operating system for self-organizing or collaborative organizations, which radically increases team cohesion, effectiveness, and productivity. Our clients tell us that Collab has helped them get better visibility into direction and deliverables, have more fun and efficient meetings with clear outputs, increase productivity and creativity, also able to make better, clearer decisions more efficiently, and develop a greater sense of satisfaction and recognition between team members. Also increase facilitative leadership confidence and build organizational and individual resilience and capacity. So we're here today to reflect on conflict and share a theory of conflict we found really practically useful. Leave you with one key practice we found key to managing conflict in your self-organizing team. So to jump right in, I have a question. What is conflict and where does it come from? Conflict, really defined by the Merriam-Webster dictionary, is a struggle for power, property, etc., or a strong disagreement between people, groups that results in often angry argument. Also a difference that prevents agreement and basically generates disagreement between ideas, feelings, and so on. So just looking around for a moment at our own experience of life and work, conflict appears to be endemic to the human experience, meaning it's everywhere. Not that that's good, but to acknowledge that it is currently featured strongly in our lives in a variety of ways from big to small. One simple way of understanding the roots of conflict is that each and every one of us as a unique human being sees life from a different perspective, the one we and no one else could ever inhabit. And difference in perspective doesn't always mean conflict, but when we do have conflict, at the root lie differing perspectives on an issue. So while differing or conflicting perspectives may be a natural consequence of our uniqueness, it doesn't make it comfortable or even workable. Differing perspectives are just something to expect and therefore to build individual and collective capacity for understanding and relating to. So yeah, one of the ways of building more capacity in ourselves and our teams is to have a map that explains what's happening in a conflict and a set of tools that enable us to navigate that territory with more grace and effectiveness. In our research into individual and organizational development, I developed such a map that I call the Power Matrix, and I'm going to introduce it to you here in just a minute. But first, I'd like to hear some examples of a time that some kind of conflict had a negative impact on the work you and your team were doing. Charlotte, do you have an example for us?
Yeah, thanks, Cecile. That's easy, actually. The most memorable time for me is when I was working at a job with a bunch of other really creative, hardworking people. And even though we all cared about being open and forthcoming with each other, there were often unnamed conflicts, like interpersonal conflicts that would just be ever present and get in the way of all of our conversations. It was especially a problem in meetings when we all supposed to be working together, to create solutions. And we just couldn't focus on the topic at hand as a group because there was so much conflict in the air.
Oh, wow. Thanks, Charlotte. I've had that experience myself too, for sure. Rebecca, how about you?
Of one of many, at one of my previous jobs, there were several conflicts about the direction of our work, what to focus on strategically. And with a really disempowering and unclear decision-making process, it often led us to do whatever we wanted with a little bit of resentment and not very much cohesion. I think this ultimately really contributed to our overall organizational struggles around funding and a functional business model.
Wow. Yeah. Thanks, Rebecca. That's a great example. And Sarah?
Yeah, sure. This is a really easy question for all of us to be answering, it seems. In my experience in a grassroots, mostly volunteer organization, there was a kind of ongoing conflict that mostly focused around one strong individual who just really seemed to have, he had a great, really strong personality and was very involved. He was one of our most active volunteers. But over time, we saw that many of the other members kind of stopped showing up because they just couldn't find a way to work with this one kind of difficult individual. And eventually, even that person who was having such a hard time with everybody ended up leaving the group because he wasn't feeling supported or feeling good having this conflict all the time. And it just, had a real impact on how people were able to even show up to this work. And as a volunteer group, it was really easy for people to just stop showing up, which is probably a little different when it's somebody's job that they're being paid for, but I bet that there's similar situations in the workplace as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow, thank you all. Those are such great examples of how costly and common conflict is in our teams. Our goal with CoLab has been to create a better way of working together that allows us to make use of our differing perspectives to create better decisions, be more innovative, and have more fun and be more effective together. So let's take a moment and talk about the power matrix. The power matrix really evolved out of observations of work conflict, just like the examples each of you brought up. In my work with various mission-driven organizations, I was curious what underlying patterns might exist in conflict and hypothesized that how we used power individually and collectively might be a useful way to look at conflict. And in order to proceed, I really had to get clear on what I meant by power itself. And I found Paul Tillich's definition of power as the drive of everything to realize itself with increasing intensity and extensity, a good place to start. With this very broad definition, I began to analyze what was happening in the workplace, conflicts, and came up with the power matrix. So what you see up on the screen now are 4 different kinds of operationally and organizationally relevant power. Let's dig in a little bit. So autonomous power is the capacity of any single entity to enact of its own volition. And an example of this might be a solopreneur choosing their own logo. Collective power, conversely, is the power that flows from the will of the many, and a functioning democracy would be a great example of this kind of power. Implicit power is the power that flows from the assumptions, our assumptions, and unconscious habits. An example of this kind of power is the power a strong personality has to sway a decision, just like Sarah was talking about, or the power that race, gender, and sexual identity hold in our minds, whether we recognize it or not. Explicit power, at the opposite end of the polarity from implicit power, is the power that flows from socially sanctioned roles. This is the power that comes from things like a policeman who pulls you over for speeding, or a CEO or executive director whose authority is clearly outlined in the organizational bylaws. Each of these forms of power is happening simultaneously. So the CEO with explicit power is also exercising implicit power based on the assumptions about what power they should have that is unarticulated. So the power matrix is a map of the conversations happening all the time inside a team or organization. And what seems to happen is that these 4 kinds of power can be well used or misused in a variety of ways. And when there's a lack of clarity or agility in each of these kinds of power, then we tend to get conflicting conflict, really, resulting in inefficiencies and toxicities. The key that we found is a regular practice where all 4 forms of power can be used to good effect. I want to take a moment to think back to the examples you shared earlier. What power dynamics were showing up in your situation? Charlotte.
Yeah, thanks, Cecile. That's a great question. I think in the situation I described with an interpersonal conflict, it was definitely implicit power and probably a fair mix of autonomous and implicit collective power there too, since no one was doing a really good job of naming the conflict.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Charlotte. Exactly. Rebecca, how about you?
That's a really interesting question. I think the lack of collective power to make a decision or how we made a decision was a big problem. Mm-hmm. And then the overuse of autonomous power without explicit say that was possible, that was in place. Mm.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thanks, Rebecca. How about you, Sarah?
Yeah, so I think that there was a lot of implicit power. The individual who was at the center of some conflicts often was acting with a lot of autonomy, kind of acting alone and not officially or explicitly in any kind of leadership role. It was just kind of this implicit role given based on his personality. But then kind of like what Charlotte was saying, the collective also didn't have any explicit power to deal with the situation. There was no explicit process for how to address conflict within the group. So implicitly, they just kind of failed to exercise their power or weren't sure or tried different things, but ultimately none of them were really successful.
Those were great examples. Thank you. Let's also take a minute to talk about how our biases can be seen through the lens of the power matrix. Power matrix can be a great tool for looking at aspects of bias and injustice in the way we live and work together. Sometimes the biases around race and gender that we've inherited create unfairness and fuel conflict and competition between people and perspectives are implicit, and they're embedded in our individual and collective consciousness, often without knowing they're even there. At the same time, we've also created explicit structures of power, such as laws and economic and educational systems that are biased and treat certain classes of people in inequitable ways, whether it's due to your race, your gender, or something else. And I'm curious if each of you can show just a quick example of how such biases have shown up in your work previously.
Okay, yeah, definitely. I was working at an organization a few years ago that I was super passionate about and really enjoyed. Worked there for many years and I worked really hard, but I just wouldn't have been possible for me to advance there at all because they basically only recognized and promoted men, you know, generally large men with beards, and that's just nothing I would have ever been able to achieve.
Indeed. Thanks, Charlotte. How about you, Rebecca?
Unfortunately, yes, or clearly, yes. I think all the above, gender, age, race, and personality, played a huge role in conflicts that arose for me at a previous job. And the aspects of our identities really shaped how we wanted to see our work play out, how we felt able to keep each other accountable, and how we managed the conflict, including how we decided if specific aspects of our conflicts were even resolvable.
Yeah, boy. And how about you, Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, going to the same example that I've been thinking about, it's interesting that both the person at the kind of at the center of the conflict and the people that he would get into conflicts with often named these kind of implicit power structures as the root cause of the conflict, no matter what the surface kind of issue was. Often the people he was in conflict with were younger women in the group, or at least younger people who were not men or men with strong personalities. So there was like a gender and an age component that were coming up. But then this individual, he came from a strong working class background and had never been to college, and had different educational opportunities in his life than other people in the group. And he would often name, class and educational background as kind of the root causes of where he was experiencing the problem from. So I think that these kind of implicit social structures are often at the roots of conflicts and are often the more difficult parts to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. They are really challenging to talk about. Yeah, there's so much more we could explore about the power matrix, but one of the most important things about the power matrix is how it points to the opportunity to undo these systemic dynamics by practicing daily conversations around power and conflict that are generative in nature. And what I mean by this specifically is enacting a concrete means of surfacing tensions or things that aren't working for people or great new ideas that people have, that arise from the inequity that we experience. And most importantly, the process for being able to move these tensions forward to create explicit solutions that aren't oppressive and new norms that allow us to improve ourselves and our ethical frameworks over time. So before we move on to highlight the key practice for your team, does anyone have any questions about the power matrix?
Yeah, I do, Cecile. I'm just wondering how you recommend introducing this tool to a team that maybe is in the middle of a conflict or seems like they might be heading towards a conflict. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, honestly, I think that if it's possible to introduce the power matrix to a team before it really gets rolling, that's great. It's it's a tool that enables us to kind of take a step back and examine ourselves and our situation, and certainly can be introduced during conflict. But often when conflict is really at its height, people are super emotionally invested at that point, and it's much harder to kind of engage our logical brains. So before certainly would be ideal, but honestly, any time is better than not at all.
Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah, actually, would you be able to say a little bit more about how the power matrix might show up in interpersonal conflicts?
Absolutely. I think you all have given some great examples already, actually. And, the fact that we kind of inhabit our biases by default, especially the ones that are implicit to us. So I'll take myself as an example. As a white woman, I tend to show up in spaces and relationships with people in a way that is different. And I've worked really hard to overcome this, and I will have to spend the rest of my life doing that. But at this point, at least, I'm aware that that's what I'm doing, and I can make incremental gestures in those situations interpersonally with people. It also provides me for, the Collab's tools enable me to notice more quickly what's going on and to raise the issues explicitly, so that in an interpersonal situation, I can get this addressed and don't have to live with it as the way it is.
I also have a question. How do you use this tool with our work at Round Sky?
Yeah, that's a great question. And really, ultimately, the Power Matrix forms a kind of a backdrop for all of Collab's meeting practices. So Collab essentially facilitates a conversation between implicit and explicit power, individual and collective. So we're kind of constantly making this dance between these four forms of power work the best that we're able to in that moment. So to give you a concrete example, the fact that we take time to explicitly define the roles that we each have, say your role as webpage, manager at this point, Rebecca, rather than just operating implicitly on what that means, we've taken time, we make it explicit. And then within that explicit definition of your role, you have the autonomous power. We are asking you to take that autonomous power and use it on behalf of the collective. And if at any point it's not working, we come back to this collective space, we surface more tensions, and we make more explicit patterns that work better. So it's constantly kind of the backdrop upon which we're operating. Those were awesome questions. Thank you. Thank you all. And clearly so much to talk about here with the Power Matrix, but I do want to talk about how to do that concrete step of, making this a daily practice. And so the Power Matrix provides us with a map of the territory of conflict, but by itself, it doesn't give us the concrete tools to deal with conflict systemically and consistently. So we built Collab as a set of concrete communication tools, a toolkit for working with conflict that you can learn about in detail in the Collab one-on-one online course. But we wanted to share the single biggest principle to pay attention to when working with conflict collaboratively. So the key here is to use an explicit and evolvable collaborative communication operating system. This is really just a clear and consented upon set of collaborative practices that reliably deliver healthy power. And practically speaking, this means that you and your team, your whole organization, have clearly defined how to make decisions, who makes what decisions, how accountability for enacting those decisions is supported, how interpersonal conflict is resolved, in short, how to eliminate and metabolize conflict on a daily basis together. The amazing power of shared expectations and agreements for how we will communicate means that people know what to do, even if they're getting triggered in a conflict. And that following these steps reliably means making good use of that conflict to move the team forward rather than getting derailed or stuck. People really avoid creating clear operating systems because it takes such a lot of work to research, develop, and test such a system. The problem is that working smoothly and effectively with conflict takes a lot of the right kind of practice, and it's easy to get discouraged. CoLab offers a proven plug-and-play collaborative operating system that is designed to be evolved. We've taught hundreds of people how to use CoLab and supported them through the process of bringing their organizations on board, and we'd love to help you learn these tools too. In CoLab 101, we'll introduce you in enough detail to CoLab's step-by-step processes that you can bring your team to get to rapid cohesion. In particular, you'll learn how to develop your own capacity to handle heat and conflict as a facilitative leader. You'll learn how to take in, seek, and integrate multiple perspectives to move your team forward on complex organizational issues and challenging team and relational dynamics. You'll learn how to creatively harness conflict and reduce fear of it, how to manage power dynamics in the moment, how to harness the power of distributed agile governance, and learn safe and effective collaborative practices for feedback. You could check all this out on this link here, roundskysolutions.com/CoLab101, or see that information posted right below this video. So CoLab is a proven system for harnessing conflict and running an effective self-organizing team. And once you know the system, you'll be able to reveal and hack the power dynamics in your daily life and learn how to leverage social change through how you share power in your team. Just a couple of thoughts about how CoLab might be different from most approaches to conflict at work. In particular, CoLab really offers a clear perspective on power, what it is, how to use it generatively, and most importantly, it doesn't assume either a top-down or a completely horizontal approach is the only way a team can possibly operate. There are countless theories and methodologies out there that have no explicit position on power, but unfortunately, therefore, assume that power flows from either the top down to the rest of the organization. And because it's assumed, offer really no reliable means of operating collaboratively. And this often results in collaboration washing, which means using the term collaboration without explaining it or explaining power or making any effort to address the fundamental power dynamics that may be causing the conflict. Of course, there's the opposite too, and some of you mentioned some of these dynamics in your examples. There are lots of organizations that are trying to move away from top-down approaches and who sense there is a way that is more fair and equitable, but who also don't have an adequate theory and practice of power and end up discounting all healthy power forms, including autonomous power, and find that they spend a lot of time embroiled in conflicts to the detriment of getting work done. So successfully addressing fundamental longstanding power dynamics requires integrating an effective set of tools and building your own capacity, which is most rapidly and easily done through focusing on a training program such as CoLab 101. And this program is experiential, self-paced, set up to save you time and energy of trial and error as you figure out this collaborative operating system. So for myself, operating on a collaborative team that understands how to use conflict for good is one of the greatest joys and honors I've ever had. And what we have accomplished together without the derailing impacts of harmful conflict has been utterly amazing. And I wish the same for you. And you can go to roundskysolutions.com/CoLab-101 to check out the course and register. As we wrap up here, I just wanted to pause and see if there are any further questions or comments from those of you on the call.
Sure. Thanks, Cecile. I'm really glad that we're having this conversation today. In the last few years in my life and in my work, I've really been on a quest to get some more tools around conflict. This is just a skill set that seems to be desperately needed. And I found many different processes for kind of conflict transformation or conflict resolution. But I've been thinking more and more about conflict prevention and what are some of the tools for just, cutting it off before it even gets so far along. And I really think that CoLab is the best example that I've found, and I've started to, when I'm telling friends about it, or clients of mine about it, describing it as a conflict prevention tool. And the processes that I learned when I, a few years ago, had the opportunity to take CoLab's Level 1 certification program, I've just really found them to apply to lots of different work situations and organizational situations. And I just really can't imagine a group that that wouldn't benefit from diving in and spending a lot more time thinking about these skills. So thank you for having me today. I really appreciate getting to be here with you all.
Yeah, so glad you could be here. Thanks, Sarah. How about you, Charlotte?
Yeah, thanks. Wow. I think for me, having a structure that's reliable and clear and helping build trust in the team and individuals the way that we are doing has really helped me to embody the notion of problem solving through mindful communication in a way that I never imagined was possible before. I've been using Colab for about 3 years, I guess. And, in that time, I have access to these incredible tools in my tool belt, and my vision of what's possible for myself in relationship with others and in my greater community has shifted really dramatically.
Thanks, Charlotte. Rebecca.
Great. I'm relatively new to Colab, but it has already started to shift the way I view conflict resolution in work, in my life, in my organizing. And I think specifically the exercises to clear interpersonal tension are so developed and strong that I find myself wishing that everyone had this framework to work from so that we could work through it rather than avoid conflict. I think that often happens is just avoiding it. So I just think it's really a powerful tool, and I'm really glad to be a part of it.
Thank you, Rebecca. And thanks to all of you so much for your time and attention. We're delighted to talk with you further. Please check us out, roundskysolutions.com/collab-101.